The copper taste of adrenaline is the only thing keeping Staff Sergeant Echo Vane upright. Her wrists are bound, her unit is scattered, and the Sonoran sun is currently a 116-degree death sentence. As the cartel trucks roar away, leaving her with 2 water bottles just out of reach, a chilling question hangs in the shimmering air. How do you survive an enemy that doesn't just want you dead, but wants to watch you quit? The hum of the diesel engine was the only constant in a world of shifting dust and shimmering heat. Inside the lead-armored transport, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee, recycled oxygen, and the metallic tang of well-maintained rifles. Staff Sergeant Echo Vane sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the jagged teeth of the Devil's Crucible. She didn't look at her team. She didn't have to. She could hear the rhythmic tapping of a finger against a polymer stock, and the shallow, controlled breathing of the men under her command. In the military, they call it the pre-contact zen. It's that fragile bubble of silence before the world turns into fire and noise. Think about that for a second. Imagine sitting in a steel box, knowing that somewhere in the next 10 miles, a single wire or a buried pressure plate is waiting to erase your existence. Would you be thinking about your training? Or would you be wondering if the last thing you said to your family was enough? The transition happened in less than a heart's beat. There was no cinematic explosion, no slow-motion flash. Just a sudden, violent, upward heave that felt like a giant's fist hitting the floorboards. The lead transport didn't just stop. It disintegrated into a cloud of black smoke and screaming metal. Echo's head slammed against the interior roll cage. The world went gray. The high-pitched ring in her ears drowned out the sound of the secondary explosions, a sound like 1,000 hammers hitting an anvil at once. Through the haze, she felt the warmth of her own blood trickling into her eyebrow, stinging her vision. Her hands, acting on a decade of muscle memory, reached for her primary weapon before her brain even fully processed that they were under fire. "Status!" she tried to shout, but her throat was filled with the acrid taste of ozone and burnt rubber. Outside, the Crucible had come alive. The rhythmic thump-thump-thump of heavy machine gun fire began to chew through the side of their transport. It sounded like hail on a tin roof, only every pellet carried enough kinetic energy to limb a human being. Echo kicked the side door open. The heat hit her like a physical blow. 116 degrees of oppressive, suffocating desert air. She rolled into the sand, the grit grinding into the raw skin of her elbows. 20 yards ahead, the laid vehicle was a funeral pyre. Through the oily black smoke, she saw him. Huxley, her youngest specialist, crawling out of the wreckage. His legs weren't working right. He was reaching back toward the flames, his mouth open in a silent scream that the wind swallowed whole. This is the moment where the manual ends and the soul takes over. What do? To save him, Echo would have to cross 20 yards of open sand with no cover directly into the crosshairs of a hidden enemy perched in the ridgeline. To stay back was to watch a brother-in-arms be taken. The kill zone protocol is clear. You do not enter the fatal funnel until the threat is neutralized. But the threat was invisible, and Huxley was running out of time. Echo gripped her rifle until her knuckles turned a ghostly white, the plastic digging into her palms. She saw a shadow move on the ridge, the glint of a lens, the muzzle flash of a sniper. She suppressed the target, her rounds kicking up small puffs of dust near the enemy's nest, but it was a drop of water in an ocean of lead. The cartel fighters weren't just shooting to kill, they were shooting to isolate. They were cutting the unit into pieces, carving them away from each other until everyone was alone. Echo looked at her remaining team, huddled behind the smoking chassis of their transport. They were looking at her. They were waiting for the word. If she ordered the charge, they would all die. If she stayed, Huxley was gone. The choice was made for her. A black SUV, modified with steel plating, roared out from behind a dune, skidding to a halt near the wreckage of the lead truck. Men in tactical gear, not soldiers, but butchers, leaped out. They didn't want a firefight. They wanted trophies. Echo rose, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but a heavy hand caught her shoulder. It was her senior lead. He didn't say a word. He just shook his head. The logic of war is a cold, heartless math. 1 life for 5, or 6 lives for none. She watched, frozen by the gravity of command, as the men dragged Huxley into the back of the SUV. The dust kicked up by their tires tasted like ash. Her vision blurred, not from tears, but from the sheer, crushing weight of a decision that would haunt her until her final breath. The SUV vanished into the shimmering haze of the dunes. The gunfire ceased as quickly as it had begun, leaving only the crackle of burning tires and the whistling wind. Echo stood up, her uniform torn, her rank insignias caked in dirt. She was the ranking officer. She was the one who stayed behind. But the desert wasn't finished with her. As she turned to rally the survivors, a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the heat raced down her spine. The sound of a dozen bolts racking home echoed from the circle of dunes around them. The ambush wasn't over. It was just changing phases. Staff Sergeant Echo Vane felt the cold, hard circle of a rifle barrel press firmly against the base of her skull. A voice, low and dripping with a terrifyingly calm malice, whispered into her ear. "Don't worry, Sergeant. You're going to see your friend again very soon." The transition from the chaos of the ambush to the suffocating stillness of captivity happened in a blur of dust and diesel fumes. Staff Sergeant Echo Vane sat on the floor of a moving vehicle, her wrists bound by industrial zip ties that bit into her skin with every jolt of the suspension. The air inside the cabin was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and the metallic tang of old blood. Think about the psychological shift required in that moment. 1 minute, you are a Tier 1 operator, a master of your environment. The next, you are cargo. Would you let your mind spiral into the what-ifs, or would you start counting? Echo chose to count. She counted the turns, the gear shifts, and the rhythmic thud-thud of the tires hitting potholes. In the darkness of her blindfold, she was building a map. When the vehicle finally screeched to a halt, the door was ripped open. The desert air hit her like a physical weight, dry, scorching, and smelling of sun-baked earth. Rough hands dragged her out, her boots scuffing against the gravel. When the blindfold was yanked away, the midday sun felt like needles against her retinas. She was standing in the center of a makeshift compound, a collection of rusted corrugated metal shacks and adobe walls that seemed to bleed into the surrounding ridges of the Devil's Crucible. Standing before her was a man the others called the Lieutenant. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a predator that had never known a cage. He circled her, his eyes scanning her small frame with a dismissive smirk. "This is what the Great North sends to stop us?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "A ghost in a green suit?" Echo didn't respond. Her jaw was set so tight her teeth ached. She kept her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the gate. She was looking at the guard rotation. She was looking at the way the shadows fell across the courtyard. To her captors, she was a broken prize. To Echo, she was a sensor array, gathering data for a mission that hadn't ended. It had only changed parameters. What would you do in this silence? The temptation to scream, to bargain, or to plead is a biological reflex. But in the world of high-stakes survival, silence is the only armor you have left. The lieutenant reached out and ripped the rank tab from her chest. The sound of the Velcro tearing was disproportionately loud in the quiet of the desert. He tossed the staff sergeant patch into the dirt and stepped on it, grinding the fabric into the sand with his heel. "You are nothing here," he whispered. "No rank, no name. Just a mouth that will eventually tell me what I want to know. He began the interrogation not with pain, but with the psychological weight of isolation. He spoke of her team, describing the fire at the ambush site in agonizing detail. He mentioned Huxley, claiming the young specialist was already dead, watching Echo's face for the slightest flinch, the smallest tremor in her hands. Echo felt a cold sweat prickling at her hairline, but her expression remained a mask of granite. Inside, her heart was a drum, but outwardly, she was a vacuum. She focused on the sensory anchors, the way the heat shimmered off the metal roof behind the lieutenant, the distant, rhythmic clink-clink of a loose chain hitting a flagpole. These details were her lifeline. They reminded her that the world was still physical, still governed by rules she could exploit. Hours bled into a single, agonizing smear of heat and interrogation. The lieutenant grew frustrated. The lack of reaction was an insult to his ego. He expected tears or defiance. He didn't expect a statue. He leaned in close, the smell of cheap tobacco and stale sweat washing over her. "You think you're tough because you've been trained?" he sneered. "Training is for the gym. This is the Crucible. Out here, the sun does the work for us." He signaled to two of his men. They grabbed Echo by the arms and dragged her toward a rusted pickup truck. Her mind raced. Were they moving her to a more permanent facility? A place where the questioning would become physical? Or was this the end of the road? As they threw her into the bed of the truck, the metal floorboards burned through her uniform. The lieutenant stood over her, silhouetted against the blinding white sky. He reached into the cab and pulled out 2 plastic water bottles. He held them up, the condensation on the plastic glistening like diamonds in the sun. "I've decided a bullet is far too expensive for a ghost," he said, a cruel smile stretching across his face. He tossed the bottles into the bed of the truck, but they didn't land near her hands. They bounced and rolled toward the tailgate, just inches out of reach of her bound arms. He hammered on the roof of the cab, and the truck began to roar, kicking up a plume of choking dust. They weren't taking her to a prison. They were taking her to the dead man's wash, a vast, featureless expanse of salt flats, where the temperature topped 120 degrees and the nearest water was a 3-day trek through enemy territory. As the truck gathered speed, Echo looked back at the receding compound. She saw the lieutenant watching her, a man convinced he had just discarded a piece of trash. He thought he had left her to die in the most agonizing way possible. But as the truck hit a bump, Echo shifted her weight. She felt something sharp hidden in the seam of her trousers, a tiny ceramic blade she had sewn into the fabric weeks ago during a just-in-case moment. The truck slowed down miles later in the heart of the salt flats. The men dragged her out and dumped her into the white, blinding dust. With a final laugh, they sped away, leaving her alone in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Echo lay there for a moment, the salt stinging her raw wrists. She looked at the 2 water bottles lying 10 feet away in the sand. Then, she looked at her bound hands. The lieutenant had made a fatal mistake. He had judged her by her size and her silence. He thought he was leaving a victim in the desert to wither. He didn't realize he had just released a predator into its natural habitat. But as Echo struggled to sit up, she heard a sound that made the blood freeze in her veins. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a bird, it was the low, rhythmic thrum of a drone engine circling directly overhead. The silence of the Devil's Crucible isn't empty. It is a heavy, ringing pressure that vibrates in the inner ear, a warning that the environment has finished observing you and is now beginning to dismantle you. Staff Sergeant Echo Vane lay motionless in the white glare of the salt flats. Her skin felt like it was being peeled away by the UV index, and the air entering her lungs was so dry it felt like inhaling powdered glass. But she didn't move. She waited for the rhythmic thrum of the overhead drone to fade. Think about the discipline required to play dead while your internal temperature climbs toward the red line. Most people would bolt. They would run blindly until their heart burst, driven by the primal fear of being watched. But Echo knew that in the desert, movement is a flare. If she moved, she was a target. If she stayed still, she was just another salt-encrusted rock. When the hum finally dissipated into the heat shimmer, Echo didn't go for the water. Not yet. She rolled onto her side, the salt crystals grinding into the raw, weeping skin of her wrists. She reached into the hem of her trousers, her fingers numb and clumsy, and retrieved the ceramic blade. It was no longer than a thumbnail. The sound of the blade through the industrial zip ties was a tiny, sharp snick. The release of pressure brought a sudden, agonizing surge of blood back into her hands, 1,000 needles of fire dancing under her skin. She didn't gasp. She squeezed her eyes shut until the world stopped spinning, then reached for the bottles. One bottle was empty, a final, cruel joke by the lieutenant. The second was half full, the plastic distorted by the heat. She didn't chug it. She took a single sip, holding the lukewarm liquid in her mouth, letting her membranes absorb the moisture before swallowing. What would you do with that half bottle? Would you drink it all to quiet the screaming in your nerves, or would you treat every drop like a month of life? Echo stood up. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, unreliable and heavy. She began to walk, not toward the horizon, but toward a small cluster of rocks she'd mapped from the truck. She used a process-based survival technique. 10 steps, check the horizon, 5 breaths, scan for dust clouds. By the 3rd hour, the sun had begun its slow orange descent, casting shadows that stretched across the flats like skeletal fingers. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in minutes, the scorching heat replaced by a biting, crystalline chill. This is the desert's second trap. It cooks you by day and freezes your sweat by night. Echo found a shallow overhang. As she settled in, she spotted a flash of movement. A cartel bike patrol. 2 riders. The low growl of their engines echoing off the ridges. They were beating the brush, looking for the body the lieutenant had promised them. She didn't hide behind a rock. She lay flat in a shallow depression and pulled her dust-covered tunic over her head, mimicking the irregular shape of the terrain. The bikes passed within 30 yards. She could smell the exhaust, hear the crunch of gravel under their tires, and feel the vibration of the engines in her chest. Her heart hammered against the earth, but she didn't blink. She was no longer a soldier. She was a ghost in the dunes. When the patrol moved on, Echo didn't feel relief. She felt a cold, hard clarity. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was hunting. She began to move under the cover of the rising moon, her eyes adjusted to the ghostly silver light. She wasn't walking toward safety. She was walking back toward the tire tracks of the truck that had dumped her. She needed supplies. She needed intel. And most of all, she needed to know if Huxley was still drawing breath. Near the edge of the wash, she stumbled upon a graveyard of rusted machinery, relics of a failed mining operation from decades ago. Among the scrap metal and rotted tires, something caught the moonlight. It was a discarded handheld radio, its casing cracked and the antenna snapped off. It looked like trash. It was a piece of electronic bone in a valley of steel skeletons. Echo knelt beside it, her fingers tracing the grit-filled buttons. Most would have walked past it. Most would have seen a useless toy. But Echo remembered the specific frequency the cartel had used back at the compound. She knew that even a broken circuit can sometimes find a spark if you know which wires to bypass. She sat in the freezing dark, using her ceramic blade to pry open the battery compartment. She used a thin filament from her uniform's reinforced stitching to bridge a gap in the motherboard. Her breath hitched, a small cloud of white in the moonlight. She waited. A tiny, rhythmic red light flickered deep inside the cracked plastic. Then, a voice, distorted, layered in static but unmistakable, cut through the silence of the Crucible. "Package is secured in the lower cellar. He's still breathing, but not for long. The lieutenant wants the camera ready by dawn." Echo's grip tightened on the radio until the plastic groaned. Huxley was alive, but the dawn mentioned wasn't a sunrise. It was a deadline. As she looked up, she saw something that changed the mission entirely. On the distant ridge, a single, high-powered green laser flickered once, twice, then vanished. It wasn't a cartel signal. It was a tactical strobe. The green strobe on the ridge wasn't a hallucination brought on by heat stroke. It was a rhythmic, mechanical pulse. 2 short, 1 long. To anyone else, it was a trick of the light in the Devil's Crucible. To Staff Sergeant Echo Vane, it was a ghost call from a world she thought she'd lost. Think about the sheer, agonizing weight of that moment. You are starving, dehydrated, and alone in a valley of shadows. You have a choice. Walk toward the light and pray it's a friendly extraction team, or turn back into the mouth of the wolf to find the man you left behind. What would you do? Most of us would like to think we'd be the hero. But in the freezing dark of the desert, when your muscles are seizing and your spirit is paper thin, survival is a very loud voice. Echo didn't walk toward the ridge. She turned her back on the strobe. She moved with the mechanical precision of a clock, her boots making almost no sound on the salt-crusted earth. The radio she had salvaged sat heavy in her pocket, a dead weight that occasionally hissed with the lieutenant's orders. The lower cellar. She knew exactly where that was. It was a concrete bunker beneath the main corrugated shack, a remnant of the old mine where the air was stagnant and smelled of copper and rot. As she neared the compound, the sensory details shifted. The smell of wood smoke and roasting meat drifted on the wind, a cruel contrast to the dry ache in her throat. She could hear the muffled laughter of men who felt safe, the clink of glass bottles, and the low, rhythmic thumping of a generator. This was the sound of an enemy that had already won, an enemy that had stopped looking for the ghost they left in the wash. Every few feet, Echo stopped. She pressed her ear to the cold ground, listening for the vibration of footsteps. Her breathing was a shallow, controlled whisper. She wasn't just avoiding detection. She was merging with the environment. When a shadow moved, she became the shadow. When the wind blew, she moved with the dust. She reached the perimeter fence. The wire was old, rusted to a fine orange powder that stained her fingers. Using the ceramic blade, she didn't cut the wire. That would leave a visible gap. Instead, she uncurled the ties at the base, sliding through like a needle through silk. Inside the compound, the tension was a physical pressure. The execution video was being prepared. She saw the flickers of high-powered work lights being dragged toward the cellar entrance. The cartel didn't just want Huxley dead. They wanted his fear archived. They wanted to turn a soldier's final moments into a currency of terror. Would you walk back into the lion's den with nothing but a thumb-sized blade and a broken radio? This isn't bravery. It's a calculated refusal to let the enemy define the end of the story. Echo reached the edge of the cellar stairs. The light from below was a ghostly, flickering blue. She could hear the wet, ragged breathing of a man in pain. It was Huxley. He was alive, but the sound of his lungs told her he was drowning in his own injuries. Above him, the lieutenant was barking orders, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Position the camera there," the lieutenant commanded. "I want the world to see the light go out of his eyes when the sun hits the horizon." Echo felt the cold sweat pooling at the base of her spine. She had no rifle, no grenades, no backup. She was one woman against a dozen armed men in a fortified position. The logic of the mission said she should have taken the strobe signal on the ridge and come back with a strike team. But the strike team was an hour away, and Huxley had minutes. She looked at the generator humming 10 feet away. It was an old, poorly maintained beast, leaking oil and vibrating with a violent, uneven rhythm. A single spark in the right place, a single blockage in the fuel line, and the Crucible would go dark. She began to crawl toward the machine, her knuckles white as she gripped the ceramic blade. She wasn't thinking about the escape. She was thinking about the gravity of grace, the idea that one person, acting with total focus, can tilt the scales of an impossible situation. But as she reached for the fuel line, the radio in her pocket vibrated. It wasn't a voice this time. It was a high-frequency scream of electronic feedback that tore through the silence of the courtyard. The guards near the cellar froze. The lieutenant looked up, his eyes scanning the darkness of the yard, landing directly on the shadow where Echo lay. "Did you hear that?" the lieutenant whispered, his hand drifting toward his holster. The work light suddenly swiveled. The blinding white glare washed over the generator, pinning Echo against the metal like a moth to a card. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just looked directly into the light, the ceramic blade hidden in her palm. And then the world didn't just go dark. It screamed. A massive, earth-shaking thump vibrated through the soles of her boots, the sound of a heavy-caliber sniper round impacting the generator. The machine didn't just stop. It erupted in a geyser of sparks and fire. The strobe on the ridge wasn't a rescue team. The explosion of the generator was a physical wall of heat that threw Staff Sergeant Echo Vane backward into the grit. For a second, the Devil's Crucible was daylight, a blinding orange bloom that turned the corrugated metal of the shacks into molten scrap. Then, the world collapsed into a terrifying, absolute darkness. Think about the sensory chaos of that transition. One moment, you are pinned by spotlights. The next, you are blind, surrounded by the screams of panicked men and the smell of vaporized diesel. Most people would freeze. But Echo didn't have the luxury of shock. She knew that the sniper on the ridge wasn't a rescue party. Not yet. That round was an area denial shot. The fire was a beacon. And in 3 minutes, this entire grid was likely to be erased by a high-altitude strike. She didn't run for the gate. She ran toward the cellar. The stairs were a choked throat of smoke and heat. Echo descended into the blue-lit haze, her ceramic blade held in a reverse grip. She found Huxley slumped against the concrete wall, his face a mask of gray exhaustion. He didn't look like a Tier 1 operator anymore. He looked like a man who had already accepted his own obituary. "Get up," Echo hissed, her voice sounding like grinding stones in the small room. She didn't comfort him. She didn't offer a hand of sympathy. In the world of survival, pity is a weight that sinks you both. She grabbed the back of his tactical vest and hauled him upward. Huxley groaned, a wet, rattling sound that told her his ribs were a mosaic of fractures. Outside, the courtyard was a symphony of environmental sabotage. The fire from the generator had reached a stack of discarded tires, sending a thick, oily curtain of black smoke billowing into the night air. This was her cover. The cartel fighters were firing blindly into the dark, their muzzle flashes illuminating the dust like strobes in a nightmare. What would you choose in this moment? Do you stay and fight an enemy you cannot see? Or do you trust the shadows to lead you through a minefield? Echo draped Huxley's arm over her shoulder. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the frantic, uneven thrum of his heart against her own ribs. She didn't use the main gate. She navigated by the smell of the desert, the sharp scent of sage and the cooling salt flats. She moved toward the rear perimeter, where the smoke was thickest. A shadow loomed out of the haze. It was the lieutenant. He wasn't arrogant anymore. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide with the realization that the ghost he had abandoned had brought the fire back to his doorstep. He raised a sidearm, his hand shaking with the uncontrollable tremor of a man who knows he is outmatched. Echo didn't wait for him to pull the trigger. She didn't use a weapon. She used the gravity of the room. She stepped into his guard, her shoulder slamming into his chest, using his own momentum to send him reeling back into the burning wreckage of the generator shack. There was no glory in it, no cinematic dialogue, just the cold, efficient removal of an obstacle. They hit the sand beyond the fence just as the sky began to hum. It wasn't the drone this time. It was the deep, guttural roar of a recovery bird coming in low and hot. The sandstorm they had been praying for finally arrived, a wall of grit and wind that swallowed the compound and the screams within it. Echo knelt in the dirt, her body shielded by a low ridge, her hands pressing down on Huxley's chest to keep his breathing steady. She watched the horizon. A rescue bird appeared, its silhouette a dark cross against the rising, blood-red sun. It didn't land with fanfare. It touched down in a whirlwind of dust and noise, the side doors sliding open to reveal the silhouettes of men who looked exactly like the woman they had come to save. As they lifted Huxley onto the litter, Echo refused the hand offered to help her up. She stood on her own, her uniform a tattered rag, her skin caked in the salt and blood of the Crucible. She looked back at the desert, not with hatred, but with a quiet, terrifyingly calm understanding. The internal stake had been settled. She hadn't become a machine. She had become something more dangerous, a human being who knew exactly what she was willing to sacrifice to keep the heartbeat of her team steady. The helicopter lifted off, the Devil's Crucible shrinking into a small, insignificant patch of brown in an endless sea of white. Huxley reached out, his fingers brushing Echo's sleeve. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. Echo, he whispered, the word barely audible over the roar of the rotors. You came back. She didn't answer. She just watched the sun climb higher, a fading reminder of the heat that had tried to break her. Valor isn't a loud shout. It isn't a medal or a parade. It's the silence of a woman who counts her steps when the world is falling apart. But as the aircraft banked toward the north, a new signal chirped on the pilot's console. A localized transmission, coming from the very heart of the compound they had just left. It wasn't a distress call. It was a digital signature, a name. And as Echo looked at the screen, the blood drained from her face.